And welcome back to the afternoon of the first day. Those of you who attended this morning's session met me this morning. I'm Brandon Hayes with both Bison Communications and Consulting, and that's one of the hats I wear. But I'm very pleased with this panel this afternoon to talk about the other hat I wear, which is coordinator for the working group of the Oak Ecosystem Recovery Plan. And we're going to talk today with an amazing panel of folks who care and are very dedicated to the health of oaks and trees across our region. I'm thrilled to have Ed Collins from McHenry County Conservation District, Bob Fisher from Bird Conservation Network, Lisa Haderlein from the Land Conservancy of McHenry County, Pete Jackson, who's an amazing biologist and volunteer. And a quick station note, is that Pete is going to be doing the session immediately after this one. His session starts at 3:45, and it's a deep dive into research about plants over 20 years at Middle Fork Savannah in Lake County. So definitely after this panel, stay around for Pete's great session. Greg Rajsky from Kettle Moraine Land Trust, and Lydia Scott, who is the director of the Chicago Region Trees Initiative. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about oaks. We're going to do some introduction about why oaks are important and sort of the legacy of oaks and oak habitats in our region. Then we're going to talk a bit about the Chicago Region Trees Initiative, about resources, about the Oak Ecosystem Recovery Plan and what that is. And then we're going to talk a lot about how you can get involved, either as a volunteer or on your own private lands, whether it's as small as your backyard, as large as maybe your homeowners association in your community, or as big as acreage you might have. So we're going to talk about protecting oaks at different scales. But the first thing that we're going to do is I'm going to ask Ed Collins in a moment to come on and tell us a little bit of background about why oaks are important to our ecosystems. A quick note before we do that, though, is that we hope to have a robust conversation in the stage. So on the right-hand side of your screen, you will see a chat for the stage. And now that we're in this stage session, we are live. Please do make use of that chat on the side. So we can, in that chat, talk about, you can ask your questions. Hopefully, some other folks who are also attending the session will also be able to talk about oaks with you and to help you with any questions you might have. And then we'll also feed those questions to the panelists too. So please do, we want this to be a really great sort of lively conversation. And so please do share your thoughts and your questions in the stage. And so I am seeing, and we're still learning this hop-in platform as everyone is. So I am seeing that Ed is having a little bit of technical difficulty. So I do have Greg queued up. Oh, there's Ed, he popped up. Okay, so just like all of you who might be having a little bit of trouble getting used to Hopin, which is a very new platform. We're still learning it on the back end, so thanks for bearing with us. And now I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Ed Collins to introduce himself and tell us a bit about oaks. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Ed Collins. I've worked about the last 35 years with McHenry County Conservation District, and a good portion of that has been working with oak ecosystems. So let me start out by telling you a bit of a story. In the old Celtic calendar, May was considered to be the month of the oak. And those that were born in the month came to be called oak people. But the oaks themselves, however, they often felt compelled to call to them other people who were not born in the oak month. And these individuals were known as oak people as well, not by birth, but by temperament. And the reason for that is the Celts believed that oak individuals were very special. They consider them to be enterprising people that were possessed of vision. They are determined and they're self-motivated. They're enthusiastic, responsible. They're natural leaders and they're able to inspire others. And although they were considered to be serious, oak people were also cheerful and optimistic by nature, and had a keen sense of humor. So the very fact that you chose this session today indicates to me that we have a room full of oak people. And we have a marvelous session planned for you today. And the folks you're going to get a chance to talk to, the oak folks, they're some of the leading practitioners in the region that are going to bring different aspects of the discussion to you. So in sort of setting the stage for learning more about the oak ecosystem recovery plan and how you can get involved in protecting oaks, it's really important to understand a bit about how these remarkable living things have come to be a dominant ecological force in our region. But to do that, you have to first turn the clock back to the last day of the age of the dinosaurs, some 65 million years ago. And on that day, a piece of a wayward asteroid impacted our planet in the Gulf of Mexico, and it hit the Earth as a chip shot. And it set off a firestorm that literally burned the North American continent to the ground. And in the nuclear winter that followed, most plant and animal life disappeared. And in the eons following that impact, as the Earth began to put life back together, that's when the oaks and interestingly enough, squirrels first appear in the fossil records. So some estimates for oaks being on the planet go back as long as 50 million years ago into the Eocene period. So these are beings with a lot of evolutionary knowledge locked into the fiber of their being. They're distributed worldwide, but they're really a truly North American invention. And we have about 90 species that are found in the United States and 195 in Mexico. And Mexico is the country that holds the crown for the most kinds of oaks within its borders. I think everyone knows that oaks produce one of those characteristic emblems of oakdom, and that is the acorn. And literally translated, that's the old English name "ac" for oaks, and corn or kern from Greek for kernel. And so that yearly production of acorns is often referred to as the mast crop. And that mast crop is one of the most valuable wildlife foods that occur in the region. So all manner of things are dependent upon it, from birds down to small mammals and deer. Just about everything will eat it. There's some emerging archaeological evidence, though, that suggests that mast, the acorn crop each year, may have actually supported early human cultures as well. So when you think about the domestication of cereal grains, that goes back about 10,000 years. But the utilization of acorns stretches back even further. And the systematic gathering of acorns and storing them probably represents the first organized attempts to build a settled culture around a single crop. When you look at oak species, we kind of classify them generally in two large groups. There's the white oak group, which includes white oaks and bur oaks that many of us are familiar with, and a red oak group that contains black oak, red oak, pin oak, and scarlet oak. And those are all species that you can find right here in the Chicago region. They also hold a very deep meaning for many old and New World cultures, both in terms of spirituality, but also in terms of folklore. So if any of you are considering getting married to a significant other, drop 2 acorns in the same bowl of water, and it will predict the romantic future. So if the acorns float together, go ahead and get married. It's going to be okay. But if they reverse and drift apart, you may want to think that over one more time. And, you know, fairies in both European and North American mythology, the small people who live in the woodlands, they're always associated with the oaks. And you can't end an investigation into sacred myths about oaks without mentioning the Druids. So the oak was the principal sacred tree of the Druid, and it symbolized both truth and knowledge. And even the word Druid may actually have its roots in the old Indo-European word for oaks, which is translated out to Druce. So how the oaks came to be a cornerstone of our region's ecosystem is kind of the stuff of epic myth. As the recent glaciations advanced south, they drove the existing natural communities that were here into continental refugia, so places where the ice couldn't reach. And the components of the oak ecosystem sort of sat out the ice age in the Ozark Highlands and points south. And then as the ice melted, they reinvaded our region beginning about 20,000 years ago. But for most of that post-glacial time frame, the oaks really occupied a kind of a limited position in the wooded landscape of the Chicago region. They were always here, but their niche was in drier sites and more open areas, and the heavier forest cover of maples and things like that dominated more of the landscape. But about 3,000 years ago, that all began to change, and our region entered a really period of intense reoccurring droughts, and that in turn bred some large landscape scale fires. And those fires on gentle ground selected for open grasslands. It eliminated the woodlands. And on higher ground, it thinned the vegetation dramatically. It thinned out the trees. And oaks, because they had that ability to withstand mild fires and to resprout very vigorously after more intense ones, those became a dominant species in many of the wooded ecosystems across the Chicago wilderness area. And the oak communities that were here sorted their density based on that landscape position. So the more fire protected the area, the higher the tree density for oaks would be. And we had four major community types that were really very widespread across the landscape on the eve of settlement. You could find them just about anywhere in the region. And they included barrens on the most fire-ravaged section. So this is where oaks actually didn't achieve tree status. They really were maintained as shrubs or bushes, and that was very common across the region. Savanna, where we have some young trees, usually of a smaller nature, but a very open kind of community. And as the ground got more and more protected from terrain or from natural fire breaks, we would get woodlands and even some true forests here and there. But those true forests are actually very rare in our region at the time of settlement because of those fires. So this was kind of the landscape that the French encountered as they began to explore the upper Midwest in the 1600s. And they wrote some pretty interesting passage about what the landscape looked like, including in the Chicago region. And they said it was really the most beautiful that they had encountered since they left Canada. They said the prairies were verdant and colorful, and the groves appear as though they were apple orchards planted by the hand of God for the pleasure of man's viewing. So they were very taken with the wooded landscape of the upper Midwest and wrote about it frequently. Now, the Oak Ecosystem Recovery Plan has documented the staggering loss of those original stands of oaks that the French encountered across the Chicago wilderness region by using a very complex series of GIS mapping exercises. I'm not going to go into that here, but basically it allowed us to understand the distribution and how it's changed over 175, 180 years. It's also allowed us to really kind of see what that oak loss has been and why it's happened. And there's basically three categories of impacts or factors that are impacting the oak ecosystems of the region today. One is direct loss for things like road construction or timber harvest or development of residential or commercial. There are also some biological impacts going on, diseases like oak wilt and bur oak blight. And that's working in combination with very poor reproduction and natural aging of the existing stands. And finally, and the one I think that affects us very deeply today in terms of what we're going to talk about, is there's lack of management, and that really compounds the battle that the oaks are fighting here for their very survival. So we have invasive species, we have overgrazing in agricultural areas, lack of burning, and we've lost a lot of the native ground cover in these systems over the past 180 years. So that Chicago Wilderness Oak Ecosystem Recovery Plan has really provided us with the data that's necessary to identify these issues that face those remaining oak groves. One thing it can't do, however, is it can't quantify the importance and the meaning that these trees have played and that they continue to play in the life of the region's citizens. We are really people of the oaks. We define the landscape we live in, we work in, and we play in by its topography, by its waters, and by its oaks, which are found across the region. And when we consider the long sojourn of the oaks, be they in a local park or in our own backyard, we kind of find ourselves often at a loss for words to describe that incredible journey that started with that impact so long ago. And how do you speak for a living being that was really born in a planet-wide natural disaster 65 million years ago? And where do you find the words that carry sufficient weight to express the importance of these growths to the hundreds of wildlife species that depend upon them? And how do you acknowledge that there are still trees in our region who felt the weight of passenger pigeons in their youth, and that were growing when young men from local farms and villages were fighting and dying in places called Shiloh and Gettysburg? It's really difficult sometimes to find the words to honor, either in a statement or in a plan, a 300 or 400-year-old creature when your own life experience of existence is lucky to top a single century. So I guess what I'm saying is such words are not often in the vocabulary of humans, but they do exist in the language of the trees themselves. And I think that if the trees could speak to us, they would say that the best fertilizer for a surviving oak grove is really the footsteps of its stewards. And I know that each of you here today have kind of heard that language of the oaks in your own life. And it's what's drawn you into this session today. So in closing, I'll share one final thought with you. And it's really not so much about oaks, but about conservation in general, of which those oaks are an important part of. Conservation has to be more than kind of a coat rack term that we use to hold our various hats when we attend a meeting of potential partners or we plan our next endeavor. And conservation is and will always be a gamble that the culture will consider more than its immediate needs in making decisions about land, and that the long future will play a role in those decisions as well. And it's only ever been a winning gamble when individuals are willing to pick up the poker cards and champion that long future. So in the time we're together this afternoon, our experts are going to share their experiences and knowledge, which is considerable. And they're going to share some of the great new resources that are available to you today to assist in your own partnership with the trees and in becoming a champion for their future. And I will turn it back to you, Brandon, to introduce our distinguished group of panelists.
I couldn't think of a better introduction to thinking about oaks on this first afternoon of Wild Things than that wonderful introduction from you. So thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to now turn the floor over to Greg, who is going to speak about the importance of oaks and oak ecosystems in our region. And Greg, let me know. Do you want me to pull up your slides? How would you like to begin?
Well, let me just offer a sentence or two, and then I'll have you pull up the slides. I also want to thank Brandon and Katie, and I want to thank Ed and the other panelists. All of you bring something to the table. All of you bring a unique voice, a unique perspective in your own direct experience. Our study of oaks, our compassion for the oak community, derive from our commitment to the land and our love of the land. And I appreciate the way that Ed has come forward and expressed a combination of folklore, traditional wisdom, and genuine science. So I'm going to try to build upon those concepts a little bit in a brief description of what I might call the legacy of the oaks. So Brandon, if you want to bring up the first slide, I would want to point out that oaks are keystone species in our environment. And that is to say that they contribute mightily to the function and the shape of our ecosystems locally. Their influence exceeds their sheer numbers and their sheer presence on the landscape because they affect so many other organisms and they affect so many ecosystem functions. So in a savanna or in a woodland or in a barrens, the oaks create the structure, the architecture of the plant community. They support a wide variety of herbaceous species and other woody species within that community. Highly diverse systems. Oaks feed and shelter a wide range of other organisms. Everything from those that feed on the leaves to those that may feed upon the fruits, the acorns, and those that parasitize the roots and the fungal growth that occurs both underground and above ground. And then finally, oaks influence disturbance regimes like fire. And as Ed explained, our oaks evolved in the presence of frequent fire. And that fire intensity is going to be affected by the quantity of oaks, their proximity to one another, as well as the ground layer fuels and the relief in the terrain. So in the next slide, we're going to address some of the insects that are dependent upon our oak species. And as has been documented popularly by Doug Tallamy, there is no other group of trees, shrubs, or other plants that support the sheer number of species. And with the Lepidoptera alone, the butterflies and moths, there are more than 534 species that have been linked to oak species. And it's not just the beauty of the butterflies that matter to us. The butterfly larvae who are out there feeding on the early spring foliage of the oaks become the food for migrating songbirds that are arriving at that time of year. And then as these songbirds nest, they're able to feed their young, with these larvae. So it's a very important linchpin in a food web that supports a wide variety of other organisms. And that's not to mention all of the mammals and birds that feed on acorns, the fungi that are dependent upon oaks. So there's a lot going on that is tied to these oak trees. And now I want to shift to something that Ed alluded to, and we call it balanoculture. So the next slide will show us a little bit of how acorns were instrumental in human development. And Ed mentioned this over a period of 50 million years, but focusing just since the last ice age, the Wisconsin glaciation. It is presumed that acorns provided a significant portion of the diet for certain peoples in certain parts of North America, notably in the West Coast. But acorns are perfectly edible where we live as well. They may be somewhat bitter because of the buildup of the tannins, the tannic acid in the acorns. But the indigenous people could get around that by leaching them, by boiling them, by soaking them in a stream. So as the oaks migrated north following the retreat of the glaciers, and the native people came together, they grew together. So I think oaks are linked to human development in recent millennia, but even going back much further into history prior to that. And then in the next slide, we're going to list several ways in which oaks have contributed to human development in European history and North American history. So Brandon, if you can bring up the next slide. The generosity of the oak included a lot of different uses. As we mentioned, being able to feed on the acorns, being able to harvest the timber for use in various types of construction, certainly buildings, roadways, causeways, tools. And ocean travel would not have been possible on a long range scale were it not for the oaks. The oaks contributed to the building of longboats, carracks, caravels, and other ocean going vessels. Oaks have been used for building barrels, the watertight grain of white oak, the ability to join the slats of oak seamlessly. Oaks have been used in tanning leather. I mentioned the tannic acids that build up in the acorns and in the leaves as well. This is a substance that is used to give leather its supple and waterproof qualities. And then finally, mentioning indelible inks, which were derived not directly from the oaks themselves, but from oak galls. So when certain insects would lay their eggs and deposit certain enzymes into the tissue of the oak, a gall would form. And some of those galls were used from which they could derive inks of great longevity. It is said that the Magna Carta, which is still readable today, was penned in ink from an oak gall. So one more slide on the utility of oaks. Today we know that carbon sequestration is an important aspect of our work to adapt to and mitigate climate change. And you'll note that some 2 tons of carbon can be removed from the atmosphere in 1 year by a single acre of oak woods. And then we also know that oak firewood has been warming people for millennia, and the equivalent of 20 cubic meters or 9 cords of wood out of that single acre can generate some 234,000 British thermal units. So we're going to go through just a few quick slides here showing some of the beauty, some of the aesthetics of oaks. Here, this autumn view from Army Lake in Walworth County. Oaks are iconic. We recognize them at a distance. The silhouette of a bare oak in winter against a leaden sky, it's something that is emblematic of our region. And it makes for an opportunity. As we reach out to the general public, these are images that resonate with people. They recognize them and they strike a chord in our heart. So we can leverage our efforts to preserve and protect oaks as a reference point for our efforts to protect and conserve natural areas in general throughout the region. And next, please. Oak reproduction does take place. It's crippled in many areas. Oaks tend to be able to reproduce better where there is more sunlight available. That's only one factor to consider, but here you see a couple of juvenile oaks on Bald Bluff in the Kettle Moraine State Forest. And go ahead, one more, Brandon. We know that these young oaks can come up where there is abundant sunlight, but we also recognize that there are other factors at work in oak regeneration and reproduction. We can talk about that a little bit more, but Ed's colleague, Tom Simpson, has been doing some research on oak reproduction and has found that sunlight alone is usually not sufficient for oaks to be able to reproduce on their own. There are other limiting factors at work, and it seems that acorn predation is one of the significant factors. It's a complicated process with a lot of ecological tangents and repercussions, but it's certainly something that some of the experts are starting to look at and finding ways to encourage the reproduction of oaks. And then one more slide, Brandon. And I wanted to close with a quotation from Doug Tallamy, and this is a pretty strong statement. The value of oaks for supporting both vertebrate and invertebrate wildlife cannot be overstated. That's a strong statement, and it's one that I can get behind and believe in, and that's why I'm excited to be part of the Oak Ecosystem Recovery Plan and the working group that's refining that plan. So thanks very much, and look forward to your comments in the chat, and we'll see if we can answer your questions in a little bit.
Thank you, Greg. It was absolutely wonderful. Now, I would love to turn the stage over to Lydia Scott, who is director of the Chicago Region Trees Initiative, to share a little bit about the initiative and a bit about some of those resources and some of those challenges that are facing the oaks in our region. Hello, Lydia. Welcome to the stage. And would you like me to use your slides?
You can cue them up, Brandon, and I just have them there as backdrop if we need them for reference. I do have, maybe cue up the first one because it has the link to the Oak Ecosystem Recovery Plan if people are not familiar with it and want to access it. So thank you everybody for joining in today on an important discussion about oaks, one of my very favorite topics. And Ed, I'm a May birthday, so I can truly say I'm an oak person. In 2015, the Oak Ecosystem Recovery Plan was developed through Chicago Wilderness, and it was written by the Morton Arboretum and the Lake County Forest Preserve with a wide range of individuals providing input and direction to that plan. And the plan itself provides a framework for what we need to be doing and strategies we can undertake in order to improve the health of oak ecosystems in our region. The foundation for that, and Ed talked a little bit about this earlier, was the extensive mapping that went on to try to get a foundation for what we're, where we were and where we can be going in the future. And it showed us that of all the oak ecosystems that were in the Chicago Wilderness region in the 1830s, only about 17% of those remain today. And this is an important thing to consider, especially when you recognize that 70% of what's left is in private ownership. And so when Brandon asked me to talk about threats facing our oaks, I think the first thing that came to my mind was this, the threat of people, really. The fragmentation that's gone on over the last almost 200 years now has taken us from extensive woodlands down to where we have patches of woodlands and oak ecosystems across our region. And those ecosystems are often challenged by not just the fact that they're small places, but that they're infested with invasive species. They experience significant percentages of browse, whether it be from deer or small animals that are eating the acorns. There's this closed canopy that's occurring. I mean, one of the outcomes of the census that was conducted in 2010 showed us that the majority of oaks were 18 inches or larger. We did not have smaller size classes, that we're not using prescribed fire like we should be, like traditionally it had been and prior to European settlement, in order to suppress other species that might impact the health of this ecosystem. And that includes the mesification that we're seeing today with the increase of maples and basswoods working their way into our ecosystems. So as I mentioned before, the fact that people are an integral part to this and have been really since the 1830s with the Native Americans managing the landscape with fire, we continue to need to be thinking about how we can value and improve oak ecosystems for the future. One of the challenges that I see is that I don't think a lot of people are aware of the value and the importance of oak ecosystems to our native heritage as well as to our existing ecosystem services today. So I think that's something that we have to really focus on. The other aspect that I think is particularly needed is increased collaboration across public and private landowners to share knowledge and information and to improve resources and financial and topic-based to landowners who may or may not know the type of ecosystem that they're managing or what they have in their possession. So I think overall the objective that comes across to me is that really for these oaks being these stately, massive structures, they're very fragile in our existence, and they experience some significant impacts as a result of the lifestyle that we've created for ourselves with our roads, our expanded development, all the agriculture that we've produced, and the change in plant species and varieties that we have here in the Chicago region. So it's a pretty extensive list of issues. There's some things that I think that we can do and that we're trying to do through the Oak Ecosystem Recovery Plan, and that's to improve this communication and outreach across land ownerships. So Brandon, as he mentioned, is the coordinator for the Oak Ecosystem Recovery Plan, and he's been engaging the public and private landowners several times a year, either individually by county or in group meetings, to talk about how they're managing their oaks, what things we can do to improve them, and recommendations from experts in the region on next steps for us. So there are a number of resources that have been developed this last year, and I'm going to let Brandon talk about those because there's a new one that's just ready to come out now. And those resources have been developed based on these work groups, people saying, you know, I really need something that I can take with me to explain to landowners about how we manage our oak ecosystems and the different methods that we have and why they work, and why they don't need to be concerned about the use of prescribed fire, and why it's important that we create these canopy gaps in order to get more light to the forest floor, to help explain the expertise that goes behind these resources and these activities that we undertake to preserve and protect our oaks. The other thing that I'd like to point out is that there are a number of opportunities that are available. And through these meetings, we have an opportunity to share with each other about what those opportunities are. So we last year were able to get a grant from the U.S. Forest Service. It's called the Landscape Scale Conservation Grant, that is funding oak conservation across public and private land ownership. And partners are carrying this resource out. So for instance, Open Lands is one of the partners, and their staff are engaging private landowners to remove invasive species off of their properties and teaching them about why this is a challenge. And by introducing it to a handful of residents, it quickly became this broad interest across the entire community, where more and more people were hoping to be able to get funding for invasive species removal. And we quickly ran out of funds because there's such demand. So, but if we can draw attention to the challenge, then at least people are aware that this is an issue that we need to be dealing with. And also learning about why oaks are important and how they manage their landscape. It has a significant impact on the rest of us. I also wanted to talk briefly about some resources that are available on the internet or through an interactive format for you. Brandon, could you go a couple of slides ahead? Go to the next one, next one, next one. That one right there. So there's an interactive map available on our website where the mapping that was done from the 1830s, 1939 and 2010 is located, and you can go on and click on the different parcels and move your way around the region to see where these historic oak ecosystems were and what is there today, and how they're connected to other networks across the region. So when the mapping was done, what we did is we put buffers around the core areas, the remnant oak ecosystems, that essentially took these fragmented ecosystems and put them into a block of land. And that doesn't mean that they're currently managed collaboratively or in a way that they could be or should be, but it does provide an opportunity for people to be aware that, oh, I'm within one of these boundaries. I can have a property that impacts oak ecosystems, and things that I do on my property does have a direct impact on surrounding properties as well. So I think if you're interested, you should go take a look at that map and just check out where you're living and what where your oak ecosystems are. A resource that we provided to every community in the 7-county Chicago metro area is a map that's unique to their community. So it's a sub-map of this interactive map that you're seeing here. And what it does is it shows landowners and decision makers within communities that where those historic oak ecosystems were, and encourages them to promote and support planting of native species in those areas in order to increase native species concentrations in those areas again. And if you're interested in that information, I'd be glad to provide it to you as well. It's available on our website, on the landing page, actually, if you're interested. And then Brandon, if you go ahead to the next slide, I think is the next one that I want. So there's another resource that we've developed to help draw attention to the historic or the heritage of our oaks, and that's the witness tree map. Mark Johnson of the Field Museum was kind enough to take the data and put it into an interactive map so that we can all access it. And what it does is it enables you to use your phone and identify where the 1830s oak ecosystems were based on the survey notes. And so you can go out and see if some of those oaks are still there today. And we have a number of people that are actually, there are little sleuths that are out in the woodlands hunting for these pre-settlement oaks. And several have been identified. And so it's kind of a nice thing to do to see where they were. It also gives you a little perspective on the concentration of oaks in our landscape, because most of the trees that are identified on these pre-settlement maps are in fact oaks. And if there's a space where a witness tree was located and is no longer, it might be an opportunity to plant or replant another plant there, another tree there, hopefully of the same species, so that you can replace what was there at one time. So I think those are most of the main points that I wanted to bring out, but I do want to point out again that we would encourage and invite anyone that's interested in attending these work groups to participate with us and to learn about oak ecosystem recovery, to share your information and your knowledge, and glean from others that have this vast wealth of expertise into how you can improve oak ecosystem health overall.
Thank you, Lydia, so much. It's always so wonderful to have you be able to share the resources of the Chicago Region Trees Initiative. And it's also great to work with you coordinating the Oak Ecosystem Recovery Plan. So thank you. And we'll bring Lydia back in a little bit as we have some more questions. So thank you very much. What I would love to do now is I'm going to put in the link, or sorry, in the chat, a link to the Healthy Brochure series. And that is a great resource that's been developed through the Chicago Region Trees Initiative, and through working with the Oak Ecosystem Group and others. I see that there are multiple people who are participating, as part of the attendees and audience for this session, who weighed in on some of these materials. So I want to talk a little bit about what these resources are and how they can benefit our work and understanding of oaks in the region. So I'm going to go ahead and share from my screen now. So the first of the brochures, it was developed a couple of years ago, and it's called Healthy Hedges. And what this brochure does is it's a great sort of introduction to the understory ecology for oak ecosystems. So what actually benefits the understory? I think most of you who are on the session today know the bane of buckthorn. I think that there are multiple among us, multiple among you in the audience who have spent many hours and years and sweat and muscles getting rid of buckthorn. And so what the Healthy Hedges tool does is it helps us to be able to reach out to property owners in particular and be able to recommend alternatives for buckthorn, because a lot of property owners, a lot of folks who live in our region, they like the privacy that sort of a thick stand of buckthorn on their property can provide. And so what this brochure does, and it's downloadable from the link that I shared in the chat, is to give some alternatives for them about great hedges, great shrubs, great alternatives for having a healthier ecosystem on their property, particularly if they do have oaks present on their property. And that could be as small as a suburban backyard, or larger. Again, I mentioned earlier the idea of homeowners associations in larger areas and campuses and ecosystems like that. So please do check out Healthy Hedges. And I also want to talk about Healthy Homes. So this is a brochure that we were able to debut just last summer, and this talks about the importance of landowners and homeowners in terms of property owners and people in the city thinking about, or in the suburbs or in the exurbs, thinking about, how they can use their property, their landscaping, their yards to be more healthy for ecosystems as a whole. So Healthy Hedges is sort of focuses in on that one type of plant, that one sort of that sort of hedge and property demarcation kind of species. This one talks about, lawns. It talks about tree care on your property. It talks about techniques to welcome wildlife onto your property. Another resource that I want to talk about is premiering today, right now, right here on Wild Things, and it is Healthy Habitats. So it is a brand new brochure that was developed by a subgroup of the Oak Ecosystem Recovery Plan in the fall and in the winter. Many of our panelists, like Greg and Bob, who were on today, helped us to develop this piece, and thank you. It was designed by Allison Frederick at the Lake County Forest Preserve, so a huge shout out to Allison for doing this job articulating what healthy habitats look like. And so the idea with this Healthy Habitats brochure is that it is thinking about how oak ecosystems stretch from within and without our forest preserves and our parks and our other protected public landscapes and into our neighborhoods and into our communities. So it's an idea of thinking about what are the best ways to manage healthy oak habitat at a grander scale. And you can see that it lays out that grand scale of our region, the great crescent of the southeast shore of Lake Michigan and the southern shore that is the Chicago Wilderness region. So this is a brand new piece. We don't yet have it on the CRTI website, but right now to debut it, for those of you who are attending Wild Things in this session, I'm going to send you a secret link to it and put that in the chat if you would like to check out the brand new Healthy Habitats brochure. And that link is going into the chat now. And you'll notice, something that ran through what we've been talking about is the importance of people. Lydia was talking about how people can be a threat to oak ecosystems. These resources are part of how people can get involved and engaged in protecting oaks. And so what I would like to do is now I would love to bring Pete Jackson in to join the conversation to talk about the importance of volunteers and how people can be part of taking care of these oak ecosystems and these oak habitats. So with that, hello, Bob, hello, Pete, and I see Bob got on here too. This is great. So we'll go back to Bob in a moment, but first I'm going to turn it over to Pete Jackson.
Thanks, Brandon. I was asked to talk a little bit about caring for oak ecosystems through volunteering. And there are literally hundreds of opportunities to become directly involved in the restoration of our oak ecosystems by attending volunteer stewardship work days. Many public land agencies, county forest preserve districts, county conservation districts, some state and federal agencies have regular volunteer work days. And just as an example of the abundance of these opportunities, the Forest Preserve of Cook County has 91 volunteer managed sites that are all having public volunteer work days within the constraints posed by the pandemic. But in normal times, that's a lot of sites. That's just Cook County. So that might give you an idea of how many opportunities are available. Also, there are a number of nonprofits, including the Land Conservancy of McHenry County that Lisa will be talking about, the Friends of Hackmatack National Wildlife Refuge that I'm involved in, the Friends of Illinois Nature Preserves, Open Lands, Greg's organization, the Kettle Moraine Land Trust. All of these organizations also have work days. So depending on where you live, there's a site near you. And these are great opportunities, and no experience is required. If you're a little bit unsure about attending a work day, to help restore our oak ecosystems, but you're concerned maybe I don't have, you know, the experience that they need or whatever, that should not deter you, because knowledgeable site stewards are available at all of these events to provide you with the basic instruction you need to be able to contribute right from the get-go. And then depending on your level of interest, if you want to get into it more, many of the agencies offer excellent training programs, which is another plum, where you can be trained and certified to operate power tools, perhaps to do some herbiciding and so on. But a lot of the activities such as brush cutting, seed collecting and sowing are very basic and don't require any formal training, and you can participate immediately. Some of the reasons for attending a Workday, it is such a fulfilling experience to be able to contribute, and oftentimes you can see right then and there on a given day your impact. If you're clearing brush, for example, by the end of the workday, you can turn around and you can see what your organization has done. Sorry about that. Phone call. So again, no experience is necessary. Wonderful opportunities for you to learn about our oak ecosystems by improving them. And it's a very restorative process for both the oak ecosystem and people in that regard. You learn a lot. I know many younger people who have actually formulated a career path by virtue of their initially having attended volunteer restoration work days. I know a large number of people that fell in love with it and decided, you know, this is what I want to do. So if you're a younger person, you may be looking for an opportunity like that. It's a great, it's a freebie. You get to come and do great work and learn about a whole new discipline, perhaps, if you're not a seasoned restoration volunteer. And I would also note that most of the land agencies in our region are stretched really thin, and so you know, they can't do it alone. And it's a great partnership opportunity to work with the land agency as a volunteer. And volunteers contribute in very many unique ways, by sheer number and mass of the size and the number of volunteers we have. We're able to contribute and to really support the work of the land agency. So it's a beautiful partnership. And that's basically, that's what I can contribute is, you know, I participate with about 5 different organizations, and they all run great volunteer work days. And the people that attend work days are also very genuine people. You have a lot of commonality with the people that attend work days. And so it's really, there's so many wins that come out of participating. So I guess that's basically what I can offer. And if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you very much for offering your perspective. And I think what we're going to do next is to bring Bob into the conversation. Bob was able to get on. And so, Bob, if you could go ahead and turn on your camera and your microphone. Let's bring you into the conversation, talk a little about the importance of habitats before we turn it over to Lisa after Bob. And while Bob is getting his camera turned on, I'm going to put in a plug, and I'm going to embarrass you, Pete, for a moment. I'm going to put in a plug for Pete's session, which is coming immediately after this one at 3:45. It's great. It's looking in depth at Middle Fork Savannah and the plant communities that are there at that great site. So definitely join us for that in a little bit. Oh, it looks like we're continuing to have some technical difficulties, and I do apologize for that. So I would love to invite Lisa if you want to come on and join us. And if you're having a little bit of trouble getting in too, I think I will also potentially bring back, oh, here's Lisa. Wonderful. Thank you. Here comes Lisa.
Okay.
Hey, Lisa. We would love to hear from you, Lisa, about landowners and sort of how they can contribute
to taking care of our oaks.
Yep. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm Lisa Haderlein, Executive Director at the Land Conservancy of McHenry County. This is my 19th year here. I just have to mention that because every time I think about it, I just kind of do a double take. But the Land Conservancy of McHenry County is a nonprofit land conservation trust that works primarily with private property owners. And I want to bring up a point or emphasize a point that Lydia made, which is 70% of the oaks in the Chicago region are on private property. And in McHenry County, it's 85% of the oak woodlands that remain in the county are privately owned. And these aren't like nice oaks. For the most part in McHenry County, they aren't like oaks in a subdivision. There are some of those for sure, but these are oak woods that might be 50 acres in size or more that have maybe 7 or 8 or 12 different owners that own pieces of them. So it's an interesting dynamic. But the role of private property owners, I know Lydia presented it as it's a threat, but in our work we view it as an opportunity because that land that is currently in private ownership, the vast majority of it is going to be in private ownership 200 years from now. And it has been in private ownership until now, and those oaks are still there. So I see it as an opportunity to work with the private landowners to bring, to help raise awareness of the need for better management of privately owned oak woods and to provide assistance, which we're very excited to be working with the Morton Arboretum and their effort to actually get some funding to help private property owners take care of their oak woods, because we have 2 primary programs that we do that are reaching out to private property owners regarding management of their land. One is Conservation at Home, which is a great program that was first started by the Conservation Foundation in Naperville. And then the second program is called 5,000 Acres, which is specifically aimed at oak woodland owners and trying to motivate them to take care of their oak woods. And we have identified, I can't even remember the number. I want to say 40 or 50 property owners in the county that own 600 or so acres of oak woods that are wanting to manage them. They want to take care of them. They just need to know how. They need to know what to do. They need some tools. They need some assistance. So we're very excited to be able to implement this program and help them do that. So I want to just encourage folks, whether you own oak woods or you live in an area, and I've got a cat coming that's, I think, gonna be in the scene pretty soon. Anyway, to not just focus on the public lands. I mean, the public lands are great. We need to take care of those. But if at the end of the day, all we have left in the region are the oaks that are on public property, our region is going to be greatly diminished from what it is today, because we will have lost, another 70% of 70% of the remaining oaks. So I encourage you to reach out to your local land trust to get involved with them. Most of us have volunteer work days. I want to give a big shout out to Pete, Jackson, who just spoke. Pete is part of what we call our wolf pack. There's a property we have called Wolf Oak Woods, and there's a group that's out there every week volunteering. And in 2020, with coronavirus and everything, that group contributed more than 1,100 hours of volunteer time taking care of that site. So the power of volunteers is amazing, and the opportunities to take care of the oaks go way beyond our public lands and include our private property. And that's my bottom line, is what happens on private land over the next generation is going to determine the quality of life and character of our area for all future generations. So get involved with your local land trust and helping preserve and take care of private properties. So thank you.
Lisa, thank you for that great call to action too. I love that. And it's a great reminder about the opportunity of taking care of oaks and all sorts of ecosystems on private lands in our region, and to get involved with organizations that are doing that. So thank you for bringing that perspective in. Now I would like to turn the stage over to Bob Fisher. And Bob, I'm going to queue up your slides. And I think there's a little bit of an echo, so I'm going to put myself on mute, and you will have the floor as soon as I queue up your slides.
Hi, everybody. My name is Bob Fisher, and I'm with a group called the Bird Conservation Network. We're a coalition of about 20 groups here in the Chicago wilderness area. And I guess you can tell from the title that our focus is bird conservation. And myself, I'm a metallurgical engineer, and I spend a good portion of my working life inside of steel mills. And I'd have to say, personally, I'd rather be outside under an oak tree than inside in a steel mill for various reasons. And I think the birds feel the same way. So I just have a very, very short synopsis here of how important healthy oak ecosystem is to the birds of our region, not just the birds that breed here, but the birds that migrate through on their way north to feed as far north as the tree line. And the image there is really, in a sense, one of the most important parts of managing oak ecosystems. It's not strictly about the trees, as Greg pointed out. It's about the understory and the opportunity for birds to feed, and for our breeding birds, some of which are ground nesters or very, very low nesting species. It also gives them shelter and protection from predators. Brandon, why don't you go to the next slide? I think Greg made reference to this number, but oaks are an amazing food source for pretty much both our resident breeding birds and, of course, the birds that migrate through in the spring especially. Over 550 species of moths and butterflies produce caterpillars, if you will. And as you can see, this chickadee is, I'm not sure if he's carrying that to a nest or eating it on his own. He might be doing a little bit of both. And as noted here, our native breeding species, they do in fact use those larvae as very important food sources when feeding themselves and feeding their young. They transition a little bit as the larvae pupate and start eating other insects. And of course, a healthy oak ecosystem supports a lot of other insects which represent food for the young birds, which need that protein. So I think it's fair to say that without oaks, the birds that we have around us and the birds that travel through twice a year would be much diminished. and in fact are being diminished by the absence of healthy habitats. Next slide. To me, this is, in many respects, I don't know how many of you folks watching or listening have seen red-headed woodpeckers. They're probably one of the closest things we get to one of those gorgeous tropical species. They're stunning birds visually. This chart's a little complicated, but what it's telling you two things. That roughly 100 years ago, the red-headed woodpecker was a very common bird here throughout the state, including that dark blue line, which represents, you might say, the northern portion of the state. Then 50 years ago, for various reasons, they declined, but they were still fairly widespread in our part of the state. If you look at the 2000s there, you'll notice that there is no dark blue line. They're not completely gone, but much, much less common than they once were. And they are a great indicator species of the health of the oak ecosystems. That latter line might indicate, for example, that spraying for gypsy moths, for example, also impacted the native caterpillars, and that may have reduced the food source. But so where do red-headed woodpeckers nest? Again, it's probably not jumping out at you, but the tallest column on the left side is oak woods and oak savanna, and about a third of all the red-headed woodpeckers choose that habitat. And another third roughly choose the floodplain forests, the riparian corridors, along our various rivers and creeks that braid the system. And you'll see that braid very clearly in the Healthy Habitats brochure. This particular chart has a not specified, but what that really means is we don't know where they were. But the chances are that that category probably divides up among the larger two. And I just point to the maple forests. You know, we planted so many maple trees, and frankly, red-headed woodpeckers don't use maple trees. They use oak trees, and so by planting non-native trees, one of the impacts is a reduction in this bird. Next one, Brandon, please. Here's another example of a bird that once was quite widespread and has become less and less common as a breeding bird here in northeastern Illinois. And that graph, I don't think I need to read out the numbers. It's since 1999, the population level has dropped close to 90%. It's losing about 10% a year. And that probably is related to the fact that we have oak plantations, if you will, but we, at least up until recently, haven't been successful in getting understories reestablished, and that is a problem for this bird. By the way, their nests are very vulnerable because they're very low. And one predator that a lot of people don't know about, and I never knew about it, deer will eat the eggs in birds' nests they can reach, and apparently will even eat the newly fledged young for the calcium. So you've got, if we can protect them by having a vigorous native understory, I think the wood thrushes will come back. And Brandon, the last slide illustrates This bird doesn't nest here. This is a Blackburnian warbler. It migrates through and nests up from roughly the northern third of Wisconsin further north. But it represents a suite of probably 50 to 70 species that migrate through that spend a great deal of time in the oak woodlands feeding on those caterpillars and those small insects to fatten up for their continued journey and to fatten up so that they can lay their eggs, fledge their young, and come back. This particular species spends about 75% of its time foraging in oaks. And a lot of people, for the first time they see them, a lot of birders, first-time birders, they just marvel that a bird this gorgeous, that they'd never seen it before. Well, that's because it's probably most of the time up fairly high in oak trees, and unless you have binoculars and know their song and so forth. The last thing I would say about this is that birds, it's an old aphorism, but it's probably true. They are the canaries in the coal mine, or in this case, the warblers in the oaks. They indicate our ability and success at restoring and expanding oak habitats. And it's one of the major goals of the Bird Conservation Network to provide data. We have a network of a couple of hundred bird monitors who monitor all over the region. We have 22 years worth of data, which actually we're going to be publishing later this year. The trends that you saw for the wood thrush, that was only through 2013, and we now have data through 2020. I guess I'm going to say I'm cautiously optimistic because of the restoration efforts that have gone on, even in those 7 years, that maybe we'll start to see an uptick in the wood thrush population. So BCN is, by the way, there's a talk about the Bird Conservation Network in the Wild Things program, but BCN is one of the tools that the folks who manage both public and private forests, lands in general, it's one of the tools that they can use to measure the success or problems that are occurring. And we, BCN, are really thrilled to be part of this program and be able to talk about what we can do. Just like Pete was talking about volunteers, we have, like I say, 200 volunteers who go out and monitor locations every spring to see what birds are there, not just oak woodlands, but marshes, prairies, etc. So we're happy to recruit new volunteers. And that's, I guess, what I have to say. Thanks, Brandon.
Thank you, Bob. And again, I'm very glad that you were able to make it in to share your very important perspective on why these habitats are so important. And also another plug, as Bob mentioned, one of the streaming sessions, the streaming on-demand sessions at Wild Things this year, one of the 10 of those on-demand sessions that are available throughout the span of the conference is on the study that Bob referenced. So I would encourage all of you, in between sessions to go and check out that on-demand session and some of the other great on-demand sessions that we have. Now, I would love to bring back Greg to what I would say is that one of the topics that's been, how should I put it, flaring in the chat is about burning as maintenance for ecology and as a tool of restoration and how it connects with oak ecosystems. So I was hoping, Greg, that you might share some of your thoughts about what those best practices around burning might be.
Well, looking at some of the questions in the chat, and first of all, can everybody hear me okay? I didn't realize that I was quiet in my first remarks, so I'm going to try to speak up a little bit. But in terms of rotation, it's always a good idea to set aside a refugia, an area that is not going to be burned in any given season. So if you've got a large enough parcel, you know, if you can put in a fire break somewhere so that you don't burn the entire unit, you're creating a place of refuge for insects, other animals, fungal spores, you know, seeds, etc. So if you're rotating a fire regimen, you know, perhaps you're burning every 3 to 5 years. You don't want to burn the entire parcel, but burn one portion of it 1 year, and then the next year or two burn another portion of it. So that's one of the generally recognized best practices. And then with regard to frequency, again, early in the process of restoration, you may find it in your best interest to burn on a more frequent basis. You're playing catch up a little bit. There's probably a lot of debris on the ground. It hasn't been burned for a time, so your fuel load may be more coarse. You may have lost a lot of the fine textured fuels, such as sedges and finer grasses that really optimally carry the fire through the woods. And then as you continue with your restoration regimen, you may reduce the frequency of your prescribed fire. Another thing to consider is that when burning in the woods, you want to make sure you have a little bit of air movement. You want to make sure you have a little bit of breeze. When you're burning in an open prairie, that fire is going to carry pretty well, even with minimal wind. But when you've got trees to interrupt the flow of the air, you sometimes want a little bit more wind to push the fire along. But you want steady wind. You want to make sure that your wind is predictable. When you have variable winds, you have variable fire behavior, and that creates a dangerous situation. So smoke management is always critical. When you're burning in the woods, especially one that has been deprived of fire for a significant period of time, a lot of your fuel is going to be built up oak leaf litter, twigs, and you know, coarser vegetation. As you meet with success in your restoration efforts and you have more fine textured fuels, you'll be able to move fire through the site more readily.
Thank you, Greg. Now I'd love to bring Lydia in to join us on stage 2. There's Lydia. Thank you for coming back, Lydia.
Sure.
And I wanted to clarify, but with Lydia, both of us, that you know how crucial, you know, private landowners are to taking care of our landscapes. And Lydia, I would love if you would share a little bit about the efforts of the Chicago Region Trees Initiative to engage with you know the cities in our region, the neighbors in our region, just you know how much we've been doing to you know get people excited and care and connect with what they can do for trees.
Thanks, Brandon. Well, there's a number of things, and I see there's a question in the chat as well related to this, so I'll try to address it at the same time. On our website, chicagorti.org, on the landing page, there's an interactive map, and that interactive map allows you to click on your municipality, and it pulls up a map that tells you about, or a packet of information that tells you about your community. So one of the things it will tell you is what your canopy cover is, where the opportunity areas are to increase your canopy. And then it talks about species diversity. If we have an inventory for you, it'll give you that information as well. There's information in there on the impacts of buckthorn and the importance of getting buckthorn out of the landscape. And that includes on municipal property as well as private property. What's important to note is that most municipalities, when they inventory their trees, do not inventory buckthorn or invasive species. They only inventory plants that they plant. And as a consequence, they're sometimes underreported in those communities. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there's a map in there that showcases where oak ecosystems were historically within your community. Now, the question came up of, I'm working with a specific community with respect to this. Well, we have 290 municipalities in the 7-county Chicago metro area. And while we have tried to approach and get this information out to every municipality, it's going to take an army of folks to help carry that message. And what we found is that when a resident is carrying this message to their elected officials, it goes a lot farther than if it's somebody from the outside coming in to tell people what to do. So it's really critical that you as a resident of your community begin to carry these messages to your elected officials. The other thing that's really important to note is that most municipalities have a preferred species list that they plant within their community. Some do or do not have a prohibited species list. So there's 2 lists there that are important for you to be engaged in. One, you want to take a look at that species list and make sure that there's a wide selection of native species on that preferred species list so that we can increase habitat for wildlife as well as supporting our ecosystems, our native ecosystems across borders. So for the communities, say for instance, around the Palos Preserve in Cook County, there are 8 or 9 municipalities that surround that preserve. And so Cook County has been working actively to engage residents in those communities as well as engaging leadership within those communities to teach them about why invasive species are particularly problematic and how they're impacting the natural areas and how their property is really an extension of that natural area. So it's not so much understanding that you're a threat to their landscape as much as it is that you are part of the landscape and that we need your help in making a difference.
I can't think of a better sort of call to action rallying cry for Wild Things to conclude this oak panel than just that. I think, you know, we have this audience here at Wild Things, people who care so much about nature, so much about conservation, so much about ecology. And, you know, I would encourage all of you to take, you know, Lydia's remark as a rallying cry to reach out, you know, in your communities, reach out in your municipalities, and begin to make that case for trees, for oaks, for a diverse canopy. And we are definitely here to help. Those of us who are on this panel, definitely me, definitely Lydia, definitely. You know, Pete has volunteered, just all of us, but absolutely, I'll put my email in the chat. A lot of you have it already. If you want to get more resources, definitely check out chicagorti.org. I put the link in the chat. Definitely feel free to reach out to me and I can help connect you to resources. And let's make this happen. Let's expand the canopy in our region. Let's expand the health of oaks, make sure we have healthy oak ecosystems. And that's what Wild Things is all about. So thank you for joining us in the panel today. Thank you to all of the panelists. Thank you for sharing your time, your perspectives. I cannot believe how engaged the chat was for the stage with all these great questions. I see, you know, all of you were in there talking to folks. And I would remind everyone that the very next session that's coming up in just about 15 minutes at 3:45 is a continuation of our deep dive into oaks on this first afternoon of Wild Things. Pete will be back. I'm going to tease you, Pete. He has promised he turned off his phones, and he will be back in just about 15 minutes. And we're going to have a great analysis of sort of changing plant communities at Middle Fork Savanna, one of the crucial remnant savannas in our region. So thank you again, Ed, for inspiring us. Thank you, Greg, for sharing that legacy. Thank you, Lydia, for talking about threats and what you can do. Thank you, Lisa, for your perspective of making sure that we engage those private landowners. Thank you, Pete, for making that pitch for volunteers. And thank you to Bob, who finally made it on. I was so excited with all the technical problems that he was having to talk about why they're important to our beloved birds in the region. Thank you all for all the work you do every day and for being with us in this afternoon at Wild Things.